Welcome, everyone, to the Myth Salon. Today, we're dealing with another difficult day nationally. We have about 1.5 million people who have been confirmed to come in contact with the coronavirus, and fully 86,000 deaths against that. And right now it appears with the going forward, there really is no foreseeable end in sight. And so I'd like to open the Myth Salon with a moment of silence. If you just bear with me for 1 second. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. I'd like to start off with a short poem by Rumi. How does a part of the world leave the world? How does wetness leave water? Don't try to put out fire by throwing on more fire. Don't wash a wound with blood. No matter how fast you run, your shadow keeps up. Sometimes it's in front. Only full overhead sun diminishes the shadow, but that shadow has been serving you. What hurts you blesses you. Darkness is your candle. Your boundaries are your quest. When from the tree feathers and wings sprout upon you, be quieter than a dove. Don't even open your mouth, not even for a coo. I could explain this, but it will break the glass cover on your heart, and there's no fixing that. You must have shadow and light, source both. Listen, lay your head under the tree of awe. So today we're really blessed to have Dr. Connie Zweig, who I had a couple classes from at Pacifica 20 years ago. Fabulous classes, writing classes, classes on memoir. She's a beautiful, beautiful person. And in an off moment, she said yes. Like a lot of you said yes. When I asked you to participate in the Myth Salon, you said yes, you showed up. And she's got 2 wonderful books. I'm trying to hold them so they don't come here. Beautiful, beautiful books. So I'm going to go to our panel and let my good friend and colleague who said yes. He said yes. 4 years ago, we started doing the Myth Salon together. He said yes. Everyone on the panel said yes. It affirms what we're about. And I am exceedingly grateful that every one of you, week after week, you show up. It's beautiful. All right, my friend, Will, take it away.
Thank you, Dana. And I want to start by thanking you. It was my birthday this last weekend, and Dana sent me a singing bowl, which of course I'll always remember as representative of the Myth Salons and our relationship that really started going another direction when we began this 4 years ago. So I just want to acknowledge and express my gratitude to Dana for the gift. Let me introduce our panel, who is starting to become familiar, and which is a wonderful, comfortable thing. Dr. Dana White, who you've just heard from, is a producer and contributing faculty member at Pacifica and is a co-founder and host of the Smith Salon. I am chair of general education at a studio school, and am also co-founder and co-host with this moderator of the Myth Salon. Dr. Dennis Slattery is an author, poet, scholar, and faculty member at Pacifica. Dr. Zaman Stanazai is also an author and poet and scholar and faculty member at Pacifica. Dr. Elizabeth Nelson is an author, scholar, and faculty member at Pacifica. Dr. Voris Nunley is an author, scholar, and professor at the University of California at Riverside. And Dr. Selena Matthews is an author and clinical depth psychologist. We're joined today by Dr. Connie Zweig, who is a retired therapist, wife, and grandma, a former faculty member at Pacifica, writer, mentor, and sought-after conference speaker and meditation practitioner of 50 years. She's author of Meeting the Shadow, Romancing the Shadow, Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality, and the novel, A Moth to the Flame. The novel, A Moth to the Flame, the life of Sufi poet Rumi. She's currently completing the inner work of age, how to shift from role to soul. And she'll be speaking to us, with us tonight about the shadow, which I dare not begin to frame or introduce. All I'll say is that it's a real privilege. I think that it goes without saying that all of us are alone with the alone. As Corbin might say, we're all looking in. We can't help it. We're all forced to. And so many of us are wrestling with shadow in one way or another. And it's really a privilege and maybe a real fortunate protection to have Connie here with us to talk with us about the shadow and to cultivate and help us develop our relationships with our own inner darkness. So Connie, I won't say more. I'll just remind everybody that the way we'll do this is that Connie will now present for 20 or maybe 20 minutes or a little longer. Then I'll ask a question, bringing in the panel. And then we're going to make sure, as usual, that we leave a significant amount of time for the audience. And tonight, Connie has a little bit of a two-part approach. So after the first part, the panel will come in for a touch, and then we'll finish up by giving more focus to the shadow's relationship with our times today. So looking forward to a wonderful Myth Salon with Connie in the panel and all of you. Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Connie. Very much looking forward to your thoughts tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for inviting me and for hosting this really precious community. I've only come a few times and it's already precious to me, so thank you for that. So I don't know that I'm a protector, Will. That feels a little off, but what I am here to do for all of us tonight is share with you a framework and a method. We don't have a lot of time to go into the method, but I want to at least touch on that so that as difficult issues come up for you now, which they will for all of us, you have some tools and you also have some ways to follow up if you want to explore this more deeply. So Dana taught me how to do this today. Okay. So let's begin with a story. Some of you may have read Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it's just astounding to me how timeless that story is. And I really know that that's because it's archetypal. It really describes the process that we're exploring together. So in this novel, the central character, Dorian, is a beautiful, vain young man in 19th century England. And he sees a painting of himself that's startlingly handsome, with no blemishes, no flaws. And he has this wish to remain youthful and perfect forever. He wants no sign of imperfection and no sign of age. So he makes a pact with the devil. All signs of his degeneration, all evidence of his greed or his cruelty, whatever the shadow trait is, would from then on appear on the painting rather than on his own face. And the painting gets hidden away in a closet, so it's never seen by anyone. From time to time, because he's a young man, his curiosity gets the better of him, and he pulls the picture out of the darkness and he takes a quick glance. And what he sees is the beautiful face growing more and more hideous. So each of us is like Dorian Gray. We seek to present what Jung called a persona, a beautiful, innocent face to the world, a kind, courteous demeanor, a youthful, intelligent image. And unknowingly, but inevitably, we push away those qualities that don't fit the image, that don't enhance our self-esteem, that don't make us feel proud, and instead bring us shame or make us feel small. So we shove them into the dark cavern of the unconscious, and it might be for some people hatred or rage, jealousy or greed, competition or lust or shame. And those behaviors that are deemed wrong by the culture as well might be addiction, lust, laziness, aggression, dependency. And in this way, we create shadow content. And so I want to make the distinction between the shadow, the personal shadow, which is the container, and the content of the container, which is what we're going to explore together. So like Dorian's painting, these qualities take on a life of their own, and they form an invisible twin that lives just behind our ego's life, or just beside it, but it's distinct from the one we know as a stranger. And that stranger, which Jung dubbed the shadow, is us, yet it's not us, right? It's a part of us, and yet it's a part we don't identify with. And because it's hidden from our awareness, it's not a part of our conscious self-image. And so when it appears, when it erupts from the unconscious, it erupts abruptly, out of nowhere, like an unwanted visitor. And it could erupt in a way that brings shock or shame, and it tears holes in our masks. And it makes us uncomfortable with ourselves or uncomfortable with other people. So a polite woman, as an example, finds herself lying to a friend. Or a religious man begins to drink secretly at night. Or a kind woman can't stop herself from criticizing her husband. Or a married man begins to cheat and feel a thrill. A depressed woman starts to binge nightly and can't stop herself. A father who sees himself as a good parent screams uncontrollably at his child. So you can see how the self-image is in contradistinction to the action, to the eruption from the shadow, and how easy it is to say, oh no, that's not me, I'm not like that. So this is a recurring theme because we're a group focusing on mythology and archetypal depth psychology. It's just interesting to note that this theme is so universal and so archetypal. It appears throughout literature, fairy tales, myths, in every culture. We know about Faust and Mephistopheles, Jekyll and Hyde. In Star Wars, Luke and Darth Vader, Jesus and Satan. In Buddhism, it's called Mara. In Sufism, this part is called the nafs. And in Judaism, it's called the evil impulse. So the Western traditions all have a frame for this part of human beings, this inherent, innate, shadowy part of all of us. We are also acutely aware now, all of us today, that our headlines, our news headlines, are shouting out the shadow from moment to moment. We see lies and greed and corruption all around us. And when our leaders fall from grace into scandals, we see the shadow acting out, whether it's about power or greed or sex or lies. When it acts out in the religious or spiritual arena, you know, we see clergy and spiritual teachers fall into scandals of abuse. We all went through that together a couple decades ago. So close to home, we may feel a similar, we may not have identified with all of that on the outside, and yet there's a similar process that goes on in each of us, which is that we may feel overcome with rage. We may have moments of obsession. We may have moments of compulsion. And these appearances of the shadow introduce us to that other in us, that shadow force that we cannot tame and we cannot control. So seeing it, what I call meeting the shadow, is the first step. And learning to live with it, which I call romancing the shadow, is a masterwork. It's lifelong masterwork. And what I mean by that is it means reading the messages encoded in the events of our life in such a way that we gain consciousness, we gain substance, we gain soul, we gain a connection to our own depths beyond personality and to a rich inner world. But that's not our first impulse, right? Our first impulse in meeting the shadow is denial. And I'm sure you've all recognized that in yourselves. I wouldn't do that. I didn't mean that. I'll get sober next week. I don't need help. Things will change, right? Whatever the mantra that gets said over and over again. And as we disown it, we hardly notice that the dark fantasy or the cruel comment gets banished quickly again into the shadow. So there's this process of what we don't express gets repressed in our lives. That's kind of a principle. And when this erupts in expression, it immediately gets repressed again. We can start to notice that there's a cycle going on here. Something is being lived out, something is being unlived in the shadow. The ego is living out, you know, our conscious life, and then what Jung called the unlived life is being lived out in the shadow. So it seems that by nature, the shadow doesn't want to come out of hiding. Its nature is to remain outside of conscious awareness. And so it acts out indirectly. And once it acts out, it recedes again. That's the pattern. And so for us, if we want to begin to bring the shadow to consciousness, to shed light on the darkness, and we recognize that we're forgetting and remembering and forgetting and remembering again, we need to actually explore how to do this. And that's kind of, you know, what I've been doing for 30 years. I don't know how this came to me. I don't know why. But for decades now, this has been my passion. And it's what my clinical work was about and what my writing is about. So what I've found is that when we learn to live with shadow awareness, when we learn to open to these parts of ourselves, we find valid needs there. We find information. We find intelligence. We find all kinds of good stuff. And our hearts open in compassion to ourselves and to other people and their shadowy behaviors. So where does a shadow come from? Each of us has a psychological heritage, and most of us know this who are connected with Pacifica. This is kind of elementary school. But we have a psychological heritage that's no less real than our genetic one. And it includes a legacy of intergenerational shadow issues that are transmitted to us through grandparents and parents, through their moods, their values, not only their behaviors, very subtle stuff, a gesture, an unfulfilled dream of theirs. And we absorb it in a kind of psychic soup in the environment in which we grow up. And we begin to sense at a young age what's required to feel safe and loved and accepted. And as we adapt ourselves and we form an ego or a conscious personality, what we've all discovered as therapists is that we don't express what's forbidden, right? So we're living out a narrow range of the possibility of who we are, because all those things that might trigger a bit, like in the photo here, fear or abandonment or shame, we start to learn, we start to adapt ourselves so that that doesn't happen. And the personality forms in a very narrow band, and everything else gets stuffed away. So we could say that the ego and the shadow develop in tandem with each other. I want to give you another little story, which is Robert Bly. And he tells this, he's a wonderful poet, if you don't know him, a beautiful poet. Dennis, I'm sure you know his work. He tells a story about the formation of the shadow. When we're 1 or 2 years old, we had a 360-degree personality with energy that radiates out of our bodies and souls, forming a living globe of energy. One day we noticed that our parents don't like certain parts of the ball, and they say, "Can you be still? It isn't nice to hit your brother." So to keep your parents' love, we push those parts that they don't like into an invisible bag that we carry behind us. And by the time we enter school, the bag is growing and the radiance is shrinking. And our teachers say, good children don't get mad. Good children sit at their desks. So our anger and our need to move around goes into the bag. In high school, we do more bag stuffing. Maybe our athletic ability keeps us from hanging out with the kids that we want to be friends with. And so our athletic gifts go into the bag. Maybe our academic intelligence is teased or mocked. And so our gifts for learning go into the bag. And so you start to see that it's not only, quote, dark, negative content that goes into the shadow. It can actually be anything at all. It can be a gift for painting or music that goes into the shadow because our father tells us that it's nonsense and a waste of time. So what is in the bag is typically thought to be only kind of culturally negative, disapproved of behaviors, but I'm here to tell you anything can be in your shadow. Okay, so Robert Bly concludes, we spend our lives until we're 20, stuffing parts of ourselves into the bag, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to get them out again. So here's the bag. I'm a little behind in my slide, and we're dragging this bag around with us. The aim of meeting the shadow is to develop an ongoing relationship with this content that we've lost our connection to. and to expand our sense of self by balancing the narrow one-sidedness of the conscious ego with the richness of the unconscious depths or possibilities. And when we make an aspect of the unconscious conscious, as most of you know, we fulfill the mandate to know thyself. Okay, so here's some examples of meeting your shadow that you might recognize quickly about yourself. Exaggerated feelings about ourselves, right? I'm so this, I'm so that, I'm so out of control, I'm so fat, I'm so judgmental. There is a part of us that's rejecting something about ourselves, and that points to a shadow. At the same time, when we react intensely to a trait in others that we deny in ourselves, we're projecting. And that points in the direction of a shadow, right? We walk into a party and we see a total stranger, a woman we've never met, and we think, oh, she's so seductive. There's a shadow projection there. Stereotyping, racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia. Those are examples of shadow projections that we're all too familiar with. And addictions. When you have a craving that's out of your control, there's an aspect of your shadow that's seeking something there that actually has a valid need, but it shows up in this compulsive behavior. I just thought that was funny. So slips of the tongue, you know, this came from Freud, right? People say things they don't mean to say, and then they brush it off, but actually there's information there about what's going on in the unconscious. And the same with humor, when you laugh at off-color jokes. Or you can sometimes get a reflection of your shadow from negative feedback from friends. This is the third time you arrived late this week. So rather than hearing that as criticism, ask yourself, what's going on with me? Why am I late for this person? There's some kind of shadow activity there. In midlife, when we have fantasies of burning everything down and starting a different life, there's a big shadow issue going on, right? About the unlived life. And in our dreams, of course, which is where Jung primarily worked with dreams and active imagination. And that's primarily where he found access to the unconscious in his patients. So let's talk about the method a little bit. I don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to go through this quickly. But the method is really explored in the book Romancing the Shadow. So as we are on the path of individuation and we begin to wake up to a desire for deeper self-awareness, we notice that there's a change in focus from the exterior to the interior world. Our attention moves within. And I used to explain to my clients that our psyches are not a solid, unified front, you know, surrounded by a Teflon wall. They're much more like Jim Hillman described, polytheistic, he called it, like a whole committee lives inside of us. And they're dynamic, fluid worlds that are populated by many characters. And those characters can change from moment to moment. And that changes our moods and our attitudes and our emotional needs. And sometimes we feel like we're possessed by one of those characters. So I'm calling those part container of the shadow. The shadow characters arise from the unconscious, and each of them, as born, each of them has a wound to bear, So the more the unconscious the character, the more tightly it holds on to center stage and leads us to feel kind of swept away and act in potentially self-destructive behaviors. People have asked me, for decades now, why I teach, what meditation has to do with shadow work. And so I just need to say something here about that. For us to be able to romance our shadow material, we need a centering practice. We need some kind of a grounding, centering practice that begins to cultivate self-observation inside our minds, so that one of these shadow characters comes and, eyes up.
Could you say that one more time? Your sound was breaking up just a little bit. I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. So when you have an experience of a shadow character erupting from the unconscious, it feels, usually it feels overwhelming. You feel possessed, it's like an archetypal possession. And you can't control your behavior. And most people can't control their thinking at that moment. So the reason that I've taught meditation along with shadow work is so that we begin to learn how to center ourselves, to prepare for those moments when the ship crashes on the rocks. If we don't have a mast to hold on to, we're going to get thrown to sea. So meditation is, and I'm not here to talk about meditation, but I need to say that it's an integral part of doing shadow work, so that you begin to learn how to watch your mind, how to notice the thoughts and feelings as they arise, and create some separateness from them, create some self-observation. So let's do an example of the method, so that, and I'm just going to do this briefly because we don't have that much time. So I chose the inner child just because it's so well known, and all of us have one. And our inner child, there's an inner child that Jung spoke about that's divine and innocent. And then there's an abused or abandoned child in each of us. There's a little person in each of us at every kind of stage of life that we've lived. And if those parts are unconscious, outside of our awareness, and they erupt, we can say they're a shadow character. So, and they have a vast influence over us. And I'm actually going to come back to that later in the second part. So let's say, for example, that a father unknowingly judges and condemns his sons as weaklings, and he expresses hostility to them in verbal abuse or in corporal punishment. What happens to that internal archetype of the inner child? A mother shames or criticizes her daughter's body until she feels unacceptable and ashamed, and she binges in rebellion, or she starves to attain perfection. So in both cases, the children internalize the parents' voices and treat themselves in the same way, pushing the inner child into the shadow, where it begins to carry feelings of what? Feelings of anxiety, loneliness, invisibility, helplessness, starvation for emotional nourishment. Okay, so let's meet this shadow. This shadow character, I should say. So to identify that, and this is just the generic method, that we developed, my co-author Steve Wolf and I developed, to work with any shadow content that comes up, okay? So whatever it is, it could be the liar, or it could be the thief, it could be the addict, it could be the cheater, okay? But we're just gonna give you, I'm just gonna give you the method now for the inner child. So the first thing that you do is you begin to notice what are the repeating thoughts that come up every single time this inner child is around. And guess what? Every shadow character has a pattern of thoughts. They're the same. Every time that character becomes conscious, it says the same thing to you. And when you begin to recognize that, you have a cue that that character is erupting from the unconscious. So if your thoughts are, I'm alone, no one loves me, I better not cry or he'll leave, you know, he's too needy, I feel smothered, she's too controlling, I feel powerless. Whatever the message is, you begin to notice that it's a repeating message for this little child. And the feelings are also repeating. I'm lonely, despair, frightened, overwhelmed, helpless. Same feelings. The feelings are not powerful, angry. They're not. They're the same feelings for each character. And the sensations in the body. So when I was in practice, I used to do this with Jung's typology. You know, because some people are really connected to their bodies, and some are connected to their feelings, and some are connected to their mind, to their thoughts. So if you know that about yourself, if you know that you're more attuned to your thoughts than your body, or you're more attuned to your body than your feelings, then you can use that as a channel to your shadow, to identify the shadow character. So if the sensations in your body are familiar to you, and you notice that you have a tight abdomen, tight shoulders, your throat is closed, you feel empty in your chest, then that can be your cue that this little child is around. So then you begin your centering practice. And maybe it's TM, and maybe it's Vipassana, and maybe it's Vajrayana, and maybe it's Aikido, and maybe it's walking meditation. Whatever it is, you begin your centering practice and you begin to witness your internal experience. And you'll have an image. At some point, an image will arise of who the shadow character is. And you might see an image of a 2-year-old little girl. And maybe it's you, maybe it's not. Or you might see a 6-year-old little boy. And so once you get an image, you can give that character a name. You can name the abandoned child, the victim, the bad boy, the sad girl. And you can recognize, once you have, this is, you know, Hillman called this personification. He didn't work this way, but he used the term personification, which is perfect for this. So we're taking this amorphous piece of unconscious material and we're personifying it with specificity. It has thoughts, feelings, sensations, and an image. And now it has a name. And you can recognize that this is not who you are. And this is the spiritual part of the work. You know, this is another dimension. This is not who I am. I am not that little girl who just lied to get her way. I am not that little boy who's crying because he feels so sad. That's not who I am. If you want to do the historical, you know, the psychodynamic work, you can trace it back to the most recent time that this happened, or you can trace the roots farther back to an earlier time. I used to go, you know, sort of when were you last triggered, and then what happened in high school, and then what happened when you were really little. And you can recognize then that your reaction in the present moment is a reaction from the past. You're time traveling. You're time traveling, right? Because this little inner child is not having that same traumatic experience today. You're an adult today. But if you listen to that child, if you obey what this little shadow character is telling you to do, like let's say it's telling you to be really needy with your husband and it's turning him off, then what are the consequences of obeying the messages of that internal shadow character? Or it's telling you to bully your wife because that's how you'll get what you want. So what are the consequences of obeying that voice? And what stops you from making a different choice? And now you kind of have a frame for how you can work with material that was outside of your awareness. It was completely abstract and amorphous. And now it's personified, it's specific, and you can begin to deal with it. So one more piece here. Those of you who have been in couples therapy or done couples therapy, what happens when two people are in the room with all these shadow characters inside of them, and their parents' shadow characters and their grandparents' shadow characters are all in the room, right? When you do couples therapy, that's how it is. There's generations in the room. So I wanted to give you one example about relationships that's kind of a beautiful story from my practice. And you know, we can say that the quest for love, the quest for the perfect, the ideal romantic relationship has taken on mythic proportions today, you know. And that was not true in every time, in every culture. So I had a couple in my practice that was able to really individuate in the context of being together through doing shadow work. So I'm just going to give you this story and then we'll take a little break. Joel was a 46-year-old screenwriter, and he was divorced by his wife after a 12-year marriage. And he was accustomed to a lot of intimacy and emotional support. And he felt surprised at the strength of his attraction to a new woman named Ellen. She was a stockbroker, and she thrived in her autonomy. So during the first 6 months of their dating, he pulled her in and she pushed him away. As they became more involved, he didn't want to face his separateness or develop his independence. So he tried to feel safe through fusing with Ellen. So here are his repeating thoughts. I'm scared, she's abandoning me. His feelings, I'm frightened and anxious. His sensations, tight solar plexus, throat is closed. His image, a boy in fetal position. And he named the shadow abandoned boy. In response to his needy pursuit, Ellen clung to her separateness. She judged his dependency and his dependency needs as unacceptable. So whereas his inner child feared abandonment most of all, her inner child feared being emotionally overwhelmed. So you can see how complicated this gets, right? This dance of our shadow characters. So her thoughts were, I'm suffocating, he's too demanding, and her feelings were, I'm overwhelmed and repelled. And her sensations were tight shoulders, tight belly. And her image was a little girl running away from a needy father. She named it Escape Artist. So we have these two people who seem to be drawn to each other and care about each other, but in the inner world, this is what's going on, right? If you had a microscope and you could look inside into the world of the shadow, this is what's going on. And so here's what they discovered. He discovered the fuser and she discovered the distancer. And I would suggest to you, if some of you are therapists out there, that many, many couples, a high percentage of couples, have these dynamics going on, these same dynamics, that one person wants more intimacy and one person wants less intimacy and more autonomy. One person is run by abandonment and one person is run by the fear of being overwhelmed. So as Joel slowly learned to center himself and to find a sense of security within himself for the first time in his life, he no longer panicked when he was alone. He no longer felt like he would disappear when he was by himself. And he gradually grew to enjoy solitude. This took several years. Eventually, he could tell Ellen that he cherished her independence, the very thing that had attracted him and the very thing that had become the problem. And you can identify the shadow in that way in a relationship. We're drawn to the parts of the undeveloped or denied parts of ourselves in the other person. And then when we're with the other person, they become repulsive to us because they're denied in us. Okay, Ellen slowly allowed herself to feel loved. And she began to feel more dependent on Joel and even to need him, uncovering a shadow character that was deeply buried in her. And she was very afraid of these feelings and she felt humiliated by them. But with time, she learned to observe her automatic, abrupt rejection of closeness. And together, they continued to bring more of themselves into conscious awareness and into their relationship. So this is what I call a shadow marriage. If we just do a persona marriage, we're going to live with each other in role. We're going to have a role-based relationship. If we actually can uncover each other's shadows and learn how to love and respect them, it's a whole other story. Then we have, depth psychology is an integral part of our life. So I'm going to stop there. Oh, here, there's one more slide. So when a shadow character is sabotaging your intimacy, begin by reminding yourself that no one is right and no one is wrong. This is really important for relationships. Unless there's real abuse, no one is right and no one is wrong. Do your centering practice and identify the cues, thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Get an image of your own shadow character, and you can't do this for the other person. You can only do this for yourself, right? You can only be 100% responsible for your own part in the pattern. You can identify what you can't tolerate about your partner's behavior and your internal character that's triggered by that. And you can trace it back, you can look at it in yourself. And then when you can come back to your partner and you can use active listening and empathy and validation for his or her experience. But the model here is not that we're fixing the other person. The model is that we're looking within. And we're gaining depth and self-knowledge through exploring our shadow issues and being accountable for them. Okay, so I'm going to open it to the panel. I have no idea what time it is. Dana, will you watch the time, Dana, or Will?
Of course.
Okay.
Thank you, Connie. And we'll do a quick round and make sure we get through the rest of what you want to talk about tonight. And my question is probably maybe not the richest that we'll get to tonight, and maybe a little selfish because it's a theoretical question I've been wanting to ask somebody that could really help me solve it. I'm curious, and when the ego is identified with the persona perfectly, you're in really, 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 really bad shape. So when they start to separate, and we can recognize something as part of ourselves, but we dislike it as opposed to disidentify with it, and we don't let it into our persona, but we're also not under the delusion that it's something about ourselves we don't like. Where does that fit in this story of the shadow?
I'm not making a very clear distinction between ego and persona. I think we tend to think of the persona as the mask that we wear out in the world. And the ego is kind of a more complex structure internally, but I see it as a kind of, it's a construct, right? It's not, there's nothing real about the ego. It's a construct. It's a mechanism that we develop to survive in society. So as we grow up and we learn to function, to operate out of the ego, what doesn't get expressed gets repressed, and that forms the shadow. So I would say, that's kind of the opposition that I've kind of tracked over the years.
Thank you. That helps. And I see that Selena is unmuted, so maybe she's got a question too.
Yeah, Connie, that was just so amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've read all your books, and I want to say I do the inner child work. I do work with a lot of trauma cases, incest, molestation, parents were sociopaths.
Yeah.
So the level of fracture, and I wanted you to speak more on this, is very intense. So it takes a while before I can actually settle them down in terms of working with the inner children. And some of them have had like 18 inner children, which was shocking to me initially when I started to doing this work, because it was a lot to contain. All of that. I mean, it was many sessions of this work. Over time, what I found is if they stuck with it and they stuck with the work, they were able to work so that the children would move into, rather than 18, they'd move into 12 and then 8, and they sort of grow into each other, and so they're left with 2 or 3. And I wanted you to speak to your experience on this, working with trauma cases.
I think that there are certain people with certain diagnoses who have a lot of splitting and dissociation shouldn't be working with unconscious material. That's just my opinion. I think it's kind of dangerous. So my way would be to do more ego consolidation first. Because, we don't want to, what is psychosis? Psychosis is material coming up from the unconscious too rapidly for the ego to contain it. So in my frame, I would be very gentle with those folks, and I would do a lot more sort of boundary building and self-esteem work before I would try to do depth work. I mean, I could name the diagnoses, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, And so if the defenses are really primitive, I wouldn't do this. Sometimes I referred those people out, because people would come to me to do shadow work. It wasn't a fit. It's a hard thing to tell people. you know. But that doesn't include all trauma, Selena. I mean, clearly there's people, so most people have had trauma. So, and most of these very early shadow characters can be really primitive and undeveloped because of the trauma. So it's kind of about discriminating, I think, for each person. Yeah, I wouldn't do, yeah. Is that helpful?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Connie, if I can jump in and I'll be brief. That was really magnificent. My right hand hurts because I've written out 6.5 pages of notes, and I'll give those time tomorrow. So this is an observation, and I'd ask you to respond to it. You're making me understand. Well, let me say this. My wife and I are rewatching and re-listening for the 3rd time to Ken Burns' fabulous 8-part history of country music. And most of the folks who really made huge contributions grew up in, lived in horrific conditions.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking about their writing and their singing as an aesthetic way to deal with shadow and trauma. And then I think of my own last 50 years in the classroom, teaching classics of literature, and how I can teach Moby Dick for the rest of my life. And I can't get enough of the white whale. And I'm thinking, you know, this is an intuition as a non-therapist. There's a therapy taking place both in the listening of the music, those singing it, reading passages from these literary classics and working them, that feels to me, after this beautiful frame that you've given us, a way to allow the shadow, both of ourselves, of our culture, of the individual writers, Melville, Morrison, Homer, to have a platform to speak. So that's my observation, and anything that you'd like to respond to, I'd love.
You know, that's such a beautiful point. I mean, we could do a whole presentation on creativity in the shadow.
Yeah.
Because so many musicians, but also, I mean, look at Van Gogh. I mean, so many artists in every medium have taken their suffering and transfigured it into art.
Right.
So, I mean, without the suffering, we wouldn't have the art that we have.
That's right.
I think that has been a therapeutic outlet, you know, since time began for people.
Yeah.
And the musicians, you know, I often, when I'm listening to music, I love the music from the 60s and 70s. And when I'm listening to that, I feel the connection to the suffering of those songwriters.
Yes.
And to the trauma. It's the stories that they tell are so revealing of their own trauma.
Yes.
So is that shadow work? You know, we could say that it's a different, like active imagination, it's a different way of working with the material. It's a less analytical way. Maybe it's a more spontaneous way.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more for feelers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's certainly universal.
Yeah.
And so I would just kind of make the point that for everyone listening, to ask yourself, what creative dream have you banished into the shadow?
It's good. That's good.
What creative fantasy or talent have you sacrificed, at the altar of your ego's life and banished into the shadow?
Yeah.
Because that's really important for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you, Connie.
And while you were talking about Ken Burns, my husband and I have been watching on Netflix, we've been watching Anne with an E, which is Anne of Green Gables. And I think it's the best television show I've ever watched.
Oh.
And in relation to what we're talking about, it's the story of this girl's individuation from a really horrific, traumatic childhood that does not kill her spirit. And you just watch her at every age, and she's so alive, and it's just joyful and beautiful to see. And, and I won't give it away, but what heals her in the story is just so beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
for that too.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I think Elizabeth.
Connie, thank you very much for your presentation. Dennis, since you introduced literature, I also want to mention another aspect of this, of loving the shadow, if you will, which is some of the characters, the shadow characters, like you were mentioning Dorian Gray at the beginning of your presentation. Dennis, you're talking about, different Moby Dick, among other things. I have the good fortune of teaching Frankenstein in a technology course. And just like you, Dennis, I could teach Frankenstein the rest of my life and, read and reread that novel. And I think one of the things I love about the idea of romancing the shadow as kind of loving the shadow is that it became very clear to the early critics that Mary Shelley actually liked the creature far more than she liked Victor Frankenstein, that the creature in a way is the anti-hero, if you will, of that novel.
Right.
So that's, I think, one of the ways that we see our culture creatively working with shadow is taking these figures that are at first judged or marginalized and putting them center stage. Like for another example would be Grendel by, I'm forgetting the author's name. Dennis, maybe you can help me.
Well, then Beowulf.
Yeah, it's a retelling of Beowulf from the
it's
perspective of the monster.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can't, John Gardner, I think, maybe. But Wicked is another example where what we're seeing is the shadow figure takes center stage, and that character turns out to have a very profound and interesting backstory. So I wonder if you could say anything about that.
I think it takes a special author to make that switch from the hero to the shadow as a protagonist, or even to make the adversary primary. In Chris Vogler's talk about the hero's journey during the COVID pandemic, he kind of skipped over what to me is the primary moment on the hero's journey, which is the ordeal. And the ordeal is the encounter with shadow. It's a life or death struggle in whatever form it comes, in whatever form, whether it's in literature, we can see it, in religious stories, we can see it. It's so archetypal, that moment. And so to make that reversal where, the adversary or the enemy or the monster or the dragon is primary, and maybe Disney's been doing that a bit now that I think about it. It's a really interesting switch. Yeah. I think, a lot of people ask me about sociopathy. So I'm not talking here about possession by the shadow, right? I'm not talking about people who live out the darkness, which we see all around us today, right? Naming no names. That's not what this work is for kind of normal neurotics. who have a strong enough ego to relate to the unconscious and not get possessed by it. And that seems like an important point, both socially and clinically.
And let me check in, because I know we want to get through some more. Voris or Zaman, would you like to respond or ask a question now? We could also make sure you ask some of the first questions when she finishes her next section.
Well, I enjoyed the presentation very much. I'm trying to find the placeness of the ego or the self, but I'm kind of wondering, because I look at it more both as on a horizontal plane, but as well as on a vertical pole. On the horizontal plane, I see the ego at one place as the main entity with the shadow behind, but then there's a mask in the front. So do we knowingly wear the mask to present ourselves one way, or are we not aware of the shadow that is probably holding us back? And then the same way on the vertical pole, are we in some ways damaged by, all through the developmental process of our childhood, of how the society, the family, and others treated us? And so that would be kind of like in the minus territory to bring us to where we are, which is, let's say, the ground zero. And I don't mean it in the political sense, but so are we assuming that we are in the negative to be brought here to the zero level, or are we at the zero level and headed upwards on this vertical pole to become one with the divine? So in a way, there is this compass that has both the plane and the pole crisscrossing, and I'm just kind of wondering that, of course, it will depend on an individual, that we could go back and forth or up and down. And I would like to hear Connie's comment on that.
Well, we don't share the same language, so let's see if I understood you. The first part of what you said was we knowingly create a mask. I would say none of that happens knowingly. None of this happens consciously. And the vertical horizontal, the way that this is kind of heresy in the world of depth psychology, but I'm very developmental in my thinking. And so for me, and that's partly because I've been meditating for so long that I know there are higher stages of awareness, right? And clearly we see primitive stages of awareness all around us now. So the people who fight with hierarchies, for me, the vertical dimension is extremely kind of built in and important. And it's hard to talk about it in the world of Jungian depth psychology, but I'd be happy to do that if you ever want to do that. So what you're calling the horizontal, I think, is more what I would call the internal depth world. What's happening inside the psyche in this model that we're using, all these constructs about ego and shadow. And Edinger was about the ego self axis. It's a different construct. For me, the self is more about spiritual practice. Contacting the self arises with spiritual practice. So I wasn't talking about that tonight. I was more in this kind of realm of ego shadow, normal neurosis psychology. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I like to be lost between those points. I'm not in search of a GPS because, you know, going from point to zero in any direction, it creates a kind of awareness within you. Whether it's on the spiritual dimension or just like knowing yourself, because in Sufism we believe that the prerequisite to understanding God is to understand yourself, and so therefore it helps regardless of how you look at it. But thank you. I liked your perspective on it in that way too.
So I didn't know that you were Sufi.
I don't think I am, but you know, pretense doesn't hurt, I think, once in a while.
So in the novel that I wrote about Rumi, I have him go through the stages of higher awareness. You know, he's dealing with his naps and all the human stuff, but you see the evolution of his consciousness. And it was so exciting to me to be able to write about that in a human being. You know, it was really fun.
Yeah, it's just the idea of becoming aware of the capabilities you have to find the divine within yourself, and at the end, the perfection, the human perfection, would be such that you become one with God.
Yes.
God is not necessarily out of you; it's just within you. But you will have to become aware of it, which in a way kind of parallels with the realization of the shadow and the self that you were talking about. But of course,
that's a long conversation.
That's a long conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Boris, please.
No, well, I'll just wait till she finishes the next section, and then I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent, Connie. Looking forward to your thoughts on how this applies to our situation today.
Okay, so I'm going to screen share again. So I didn't keep the position here. Okay, so now we're going to shift to meeting the collective shadow. And, you know, our personal shadows are embedded, right, in our family systems. And you may be able to identify shadow characters or shadow issues in your whole family. And the same is true in other kinds of groups and tribes, like if you're part of a religious community, or you're part of an ethnic community, or, you know, there are shadow issues that are shared, right, by that group. And the same with larger cultures, like nations, and the same with the global community. There are these collective shadow issues. So our personal shadow is not like a little lonely electron circling by itself out there. It's all connected, as you can see in your dreams. I mean, that's a really great place to see all the connections. So, I'm in the wrong. Dana doesn't like this screen. Okay. So, the coronavirus, the whole pandemic that we're in right now. So one of the first associations that came up for me was, because I'm so focused always on shadow, was denial. And we're seeing a lot of denial in all different kinds of forms all around us. And I think one form that it takes, like the protesters who want to open everything up, or the people who don't social distance, and some of them are in my world. It's challenging trying to make sense of it. And I think one possibility is that the puer archetype is activated in them. And so what do I mean by that? So the puer refuses the call to human life, refuses the call to embodiment, right? The puer denies mortality. Remember the story of Icarus flying? His father kept telling him not to fly so high, and he flew to the sun and his wings were burned. So we're seeing a lot of denial of mortality around us. And we're also seeing regression to earlier stages. And this is that vertical point, Zeman. So we're seeing people who are responding in childlike ways, and people who are responding in adolescent, rebellious, you know, don't tell me what to do kind of ways. We see a lot of defenses, you know, the kind of the primitive defenses that come up around projection and stereotyping. Ageism has just been astonishing to me, you know. Let's sacrifice grandma because she's lived her life. Racism and conspiracy theories, paranoia. So these are primitive defenses that in some ways are understandable under the stress that everybody's feeling and the fear that everybody's feeling, but they're not conscious responses to the danger, right? They're unconscious, regressive responses. And then there's the denial of science. And I'm not saying that rationality and science are the highest stages of development, but most of humanity is not even functioning at the level of rationality yet. That's how primitive we are. So there's this denial of, you know, the scientists, and you see every day what a terrible time these scientists are having just trying to be heard and trying to get the information out. There's a denial of limits, you know, which is a key trait in the puer archetype. No limits, no responsibilities. Freedom at all costs. And people want the freedom to die, which is really interesting to me when you like try to figure that out. People want the freedom to play, to die, and to infect other people. So there's a possession here that's not connected to life. It's not connected to the life force. And, you know, if your priority is to do what you want when you want, rather than to protect yourself and protect other people, something's going on here. What is going on in this psychology? And, you know, I had to mention this, but I don't want to go into it because I think it's kind of touchy. But there's a subgroup of people who are apocalyptic and want the end of the world because they believe they'll be saved. And so, you know, I think that group of people is thinking, let's let the non-believers be sacrificed so that we can be in the rapture. And that's pretty scary, really, when you think about it. And it has this puer quality in the sense of, you know, take me up to heaven. I don't need to be human, right? I just want to be with God in heaven. But this is the reality. This is the reality that we're faced with. And, you know, I just completed a book about late life, the inner work of age, where I'm extending shadow work into late life, 60s, 70s, 80s. And one of the key teachings is about mortality awareness and really breaking through the denial of mortality so that we can choose what we want to do with our lives in late life. And what's happening now is it's everywhere. Mortality awareness, you can't get away from it. And yet, even still, there are people denying. People feel that there are people who feel invincible. So there's some mythic themes here that I kind of just wanted to delineate. Pandemic, pandemonium, panic all come from pan. And then I went back and I looked at Camus' novel, The Plague. I don't know if any of you, I read Camus when I was very young and I was studying French. And this novel just came back to me. And it was about a cholera epidemic. But the themes, everything that we're experiencing today in this moment was in that novel. I forget when it was. Was it in the, I forget the year of the novel. But it kind of knocked my socks off, how prescient it was. You can see in the characters, you can see denial, indifference, and blame. People are quarantined. They recognize that everyone is a carrier. They're counting up death tallies. They're searching for a serum. They call it a serum. And they recognize then that it becomes airborne. And so there's incredible panic because there's no safe place. And then there's paranoia and projection and splitting because people are regressing. And you know, one of the points here is that this is a setup for authoritarianism. And you can see the government consolidating power in all kinds of ways. And when there's that much chaos in the environment, people want order no matter what. And that's a very dangerous moment. And it's not, doesn't only happen under pandemic. I mean, it happens under war and other circumstances. But I think it's a theme that is archetypal and that we need to keep our attention on. There are psychological reversals in this kind of a time where rich become poor, honest become thief. And there's a reversal of the mythology. You know, in most myths, the elders are sacrificing youth, right? And now the youth want to sacrifice elders. So death is the leveler here in this kind of situation. In Camus' novel, it's rats who bring the disease, and with us, it's bats. So there's this kind of bat out of hell image for me that's been sitting with me. And then I thought, you know, what is quarantine? We were kind of playing unaware in the upper world, like Persephone. We were in denial of massive inequality. We were in denial of climate change. And all of a sudden, we were abducted by the Lord of Death. And quarantine is like living in Hades. It's almost like the upper world and the underworld have flipped. You know, the upper world is Hades now. Everybody's in Hades. So Persephone stays in the underworld and she transforms. You know, she really goes through this alchemical shift. And so what is asked of us for self-reflection in quarantine? And, you know, can we slow down enough and turn within and attune to the self, or the queen and the king within, and begin to make that internal shift in ourselves. So that out of all this death, there is some rebirth. Okay, so that's where I'll stop for conversation with you.
Thank you, Connie. And I want to make sure we get to everybody. So I thought I'd ask Boris if you want to jump in, if you have a question.
Yes, I do. First of all, thanks a lot, Connie, for the presentation. Whenever I hear you talk or I read your books, I feel simultaneously stripped and healed. And so I really very much appreciate that. So thank you. What I want to ask you about is, and I think you've kind of touched upon it, instead of romancing the shadow, could you talk a little bit about suffering, the shadow, and its relationship to the underworld? And the reason I'm asking that question is I thought you really pointed out in a kind of cogent way how the shadow is a place for both treasure and poverty, for poison and cure. And if you think about suffering, and Lionel Corbett does a wonderful job of this in The Soul and Anguish, when he points out that etymologically, suffering contains a phrase that means both burden and treasure. And so that's what suffering, so the notion of suffering itself includes both. So could you talk a little more about that in terms of suffering and this relationship to the shadow and the underworld, if you like?
Great question. So I want to share the screen with my last slide so that people can contact me while I talk with Boris, okay? You know, my first Jungian analyst said to me something that I'll never forget. She said, your spiritual work cannot save you from shadow suffering. And there's an inevitability to meeting the shadow and to suffering the shadow in being human. I mean, it's just part of how we're made and part of the hero's journey and part of the human incarnation. And so there's meaning in it, and there's depth in it, and there's reconciliation in it. But I think what I'm trying to offer is, and I'm not offering a way to fix it. That's not it. But what I'm suggesting is that there is a way to be with it that is evolutionary, rather than kind of dwelling in the muck. You know, oh my God, I'm suffering so much, you know, and grieving a loss for the rest of your life, or you know, like taking on, identifying with the suffering, identifying with it. That's the issue. And so I'm just suggesting that there's a way to take shadow suffering and use it to gain consciousness. And I know there are people who disagree with this. I mean, I got a lot of gripes from Jungians when Romancing the Shadow came out. First of all, the word romancing made it seem so light. And second of all, the method was, you know, this or that or the other thing. So I know there are people who don't agree with this, but what I'm just trying to say is we can make a conscious relationship to this unconscious material, not to all of it, you know, not to all of it, but to some of it, and really improve our lives by doing that. And really reduce our suffering by doing that. Not eliminate it, but reduce it. Is that helpful?
Yes, very much so. Thanks a lot. Very helpful.
The place I wanted to go with it today was related to what I will call the cultural shadow. And it has to do really with an overt sense of privilege or exceptionalism or entitlement and as a species. We can't take responsibility for the coronavirus because we don't own it. We see it as something that's happening to us. And so our relationship to the natural world and to one another makes it very difficult for us to find a way to coexist within this, because we don't take responsibility for any role that we have, either as individuals or as a species. The thing that concerns me most is that I believe that these behaviors that are coming out now, the wearing of the masks, I like the phrase that somebody used the other day in the news called public distancing rather than social distancing. I thought there was sort of a distinction that made something there. But that this is going to become the new racism, the new way that these people who are putting themselves out on the front lines, and they're marginalized to begin with, are the first victims that are going down, that are going down in this coronavirus. Those who can afford to separate, and they're not getting caught up in it. But it comes out of an extended sense of privilege. And that sense of privilege could be called affluence, but it's not always affluent, because you can be affluent and still be discriminated against. It has to do with this unconscious sense of, I feel like I am the Lord over the world in which I run. And you can see it happening at the highest levels of our culture. But I'm concerned, and which is one of the reasons we started this Myth Salon, which spoke to the whole idea that we've got to do something to raise the level of consciousness about it, so that the wounds of our culture become exposed to people who can do something about it. Now, did anybody raise hands? I see people, but I don't know that I see hands. Nope.
I saw Colette had a question, and Cecilia.
Okay. I don't see a hand raised, but does Cecilia want to say something?
Yeah, I don't know how to pull them in. Can you?
Okay, I can allow to talk. Okay.
Okay, great.
So now Cecilia is.
Hello.
Yep. It's not Cecilia. It's Salika.
Salika, yes.
Salika.
Yes. Good
Okay.
evening. I just want to first say thank you to everyone for this talk. It's been wonderful. My question was for Connie. I noticed that in working with the shadow, you suggest witnessing, naming, and classifying the archetype. But what about entering into a dialogue with the shadow, asking for images or names, dialoguing with our inner community, so to speak?
I think that's a wonderful practice, Selika. And I've worked with that in many different ways. So initially, what's important is to identify and personify the specific character, right? And then, so you do that by thoughts, feelings, and sensations, getting an image and naming it, right? So it's specific to you. And then you can make a conscious relationship to it. And one way to continue that is to dialogue with it, listen to it, speak to it, write a letter to it, respond to it that way. That's great. That's like active imagination with a part of your psyche that was previously outside of awareness. So I love that. You can draw it. You can also draw or paint it. You can dance it. You can find, you can write poetry to it. You can open the communication so that you can uncover part of the gold in the dark side that I refer to is the deeper needs of that part of you.
Mm.
because there are really valid physical, emotional, psychic needs inside those characters that are acting out. You know, so with addiction, you know, there's often a longing for spirit. Jung pointed out, I think he had a dialogue with Bill W. before he founded Alcoholics Anonymous. And they talked about spirits, alcohol and spirit, that there's a connection there. There are these connections, and I've had people do this with food. There's a, you know, a sublimation of other desires and fantasies in the addiction that lands on the object of addiction. And there's a valid need underneath that self-destructive behavior. So you can uncover all kinds of things by dialoguing with that part of yourself. But the
Wonderful.
first step is to bring it into awareness, because it won't dialogue with you when it's in the shadow.
Could you recommend any works aside from Hillman or Jung that have to do with entering into dialogue?
There was a school called Voice Dialogue where they did kind of communication with parts. It was different from my method, but you might look at that. And you know, the whole kind of Jungian idea of active imagination is dialoguing with creativity with your unconscious.
Mm.
Yeah.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Selika. Let's go to Colette. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I would like Connie to speak on something I'm working with in myself at the moment, and it's the connection between racism and the misuse of language. We talk of black, you know, the black box after an airplane crash, when in fact the box is orange and it's a computer box. We talk about the dark web, black money, not illegal money. And we're constantly in movie titles and book titles and all sorts of things, everyday language, using dark or black as a metaphor for evil or decadence or something that needs to be transformed, and using white and light as something to attain that's pure and holy. And I'm just wondering how, you know, I feel working as I do at the moment in a project in the Netherlands with racism, I feel we'll never get, you know, every time these words are used in that metaphoric context, it creates an image. And the image is, you know, can be so easily projected onto people. So I'm wondering if we can ever heal our racist problem without also, or at the same time, or beforehand, even healing our use of language. And what anybody can comment on this. And yeah, that's basically it.
Thank
You
you.
know, we struggled with that when we did Meeting the Shadow, because we recognized your point. There's a split in the semantic, in the structure of our language that reflects a split in the psyche. And we were very concerned about it at the time, and that's a long time ago, and nothing much has changed. And so I wholeheartedly agree with you. I don't know what to do about it. It's certainly reinforced in, you know, movies and books, and it's not a superficial issue. It's a profound kind of universal and archetypal issue. And I don't know what to do about it. I don't have another language to refer to, you know, the dark side and the light side, the shadow and the conscious awareness. I don't have another language. So I think we apologized for it in Meeting the Shadow. But it's a really good point.
Thank you, and I'll share with the panel that I'm not seeing any other questions yet from the group. So if there's a question that you have that you've been, or a thought or a comment you have that you want to bring in, it looks like we'll have a little bit of a chance to do that. So please do.
First of all, I want to congratulate Colette for asking that question. It's a very brave question that gets to the core of what meaning and what it does in life. I highly recommend reading Audre Lorde's The Transformation of Silence into Action. She's self-described as lesbian, feminist, literary critic, et cetera, et cetera. And she actually offers something that you can do, that we can do. And I tell my students in my classes all the time that the dumbest thing that's ever been said is that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Yeah.
And instead, I quote Hortense Spillers, who says, sticks and stones will definitely break our bones, and words will certainly kill us. So I think you've tapped into something that's very, very important. So thank you for that. And my next is, I want to ask Connie another question here. And it's about, and I hope this comes up. Can you see, this is Connie's Inner Work of Age.
Uh-huh.
And I loved when you wrote that the virus is to boomers what the climate crisis is to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go on to write, yet both reveal a spiritual truth. Could you talk about that? And it was really productive for me because I always like to think of myself as, well, I'm not part of that other group. I'm part of the group that's smart. But what you wrote here is like, well, I'm actually part of that group that has its own blind spot. So if you could talk about either one of those, I'd really appreciate it. Or not.
Yeah, you know, everybody keeps talking about we're in this together. And it's kind of become glib. And what level does it refer to? Because, you know, as Dana was just saying, with the classism and the racism so revealed, who's in it together? I mean, what does that even mean? It's a beautiful sentiment, but, you know, what does that even mean? So what I was referring to, I know that quote from a young woman, I think she's 19, she said to me, the virus is to boomers what the climate crisis is to us. And it's not only life-threatening, but it's revealing that interdependence, revealing the globalism, the need that we all have to cooperate and collaborate and meet the needs of the times. And then there's the deeper level, which is that spiritually, we are one body, we are one spirit. And that is so far outside of most human beings' awareness that that is in the shadow. You know, our unity is actually in the shadow because we focused on individualism, right? And the freedom to, like Dana said, the freedom to be entitled and take whatever we need. Like that guy who bought 17,000 bottles of sanitizers, you know, 17,000 bottles of sanitizer, right? It's just kind of symbolic. It's just symbolic of, it's actually not a radical thing given what our culture is like.
Right.
So, and I hear a lot about, you know, the silver linings of this pandemic. And one of them is that it's making us realize, you know, how much we need each other. But I don't know, with sociopaths in charge all over the world now, if we're really going to come out of this in the way that we could. If we really had a visionary, if we had a vision, if we had leadership, if we had all of the sort of cultural tools that we needed. I mean, we have a lot of innovation, we have a lot of money, we have a lot of the things that we need. But if we had that, what we really need, we could come out of this in a rebirth. We could come out of it with a Green New Deal. I mean, we could come out of it with all Medicare for all. We could come out of it with all kinds of incredible change, right? But given what's happening, that's not going to happen. So I guess that's the parallel between the virus and the climate crisis. I've been very active in fighting climate for a lot of years now in my own little way. And, you know, once the virus is gone, that will come roaring back. So I don't really see in my lifetime that we're going to get much of a break on that level. And, you know, not a positive thing to say, but that's kind of how I feel. Thanks for looking at my website.
Simone, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm just thinking like maybe there is a kind of subconscious cultural relativism in this context of what we referred to earlier as the racist element in it. Is because when we look at outside, you know, non-European thinking, the first creator is the darkness, and the darkness is that of the womb. And in Arabic, the word for the mercy of God, which is God's greatest attribute, is the same word that is a word for the womb. In other words, they're both the birthing places of concepts. And then we also have the idea of Layl, the night, which gives birth to things. And then again, in Islamic calendars, always the night comes, the dark night comes before the bright day. In other words, it's the night that gives the birth. In the context of often in poetic language, they would say it's not the whiteness, the white part of your eye that sees, it's the black part that sees, that has the vision. We also have the concept of the god, which was in the pre-Zoroastrian period, and I'm talking geographic environs of Central Asia, Afghanistan, where I come from, is that Dev or Dev was the god, but it was equal also to the color black. And so the gods were black, the creation was black, the womb was black. All of this was in a very, very positive way. And I think we might be kind of thinking about it a little too too Eurocentric.
Yes, I agree.
Even from a certain period of the slaves that were brought from Africa, for instance, they were not called by a color, but rather that they would be they would put on bills around their necks, perhaps, so that they wouldn't run away. And so the word for that is zang. And from where they got the slave would be called the zangi, and they were brought from an island off the shore of East Africa, which eventually was then called Zanzibar. which then we goes through an Arabic phonetic transformation, becomes Zanzibar and Zanzibar, which became a country, and then it became incorporated into Tanganyika and Zanzibar, it became Tanzania. So again, the color was not there, even at the time when they were bringing slaves from Africa. But I think the color black had more divinity attached to it, originality, the birthing, in the universal context and in the visual context. But that was, of course, then. But now with the prevalence of Western culture, I think that the blackness associated with the race's inferiority and all the rest of it is kind of permeating through other cultures, I guess, in some ways. So I don't know when this shift occurred historically, but I don't think it was there always.
That's a beautiful point. I mean, it made me remember Kali is black from India.
Yes.
She's the goddess of birth
Right.
and death and transformation. All three. The Black Madonna.
Right.
So there are these archetypal images from other cultures in which the associations to blackness are very different.
That's why I'm saying that I think this association might be a more recent phenomenon that we kind of absorbed without becoming aware of it.
Yeah.
I think it might be that.
I might suggest that if you do take the Eurocentric perspective, then you might see everything outside of it as the unconscious to the European perspective. And so in some ways, what you're suggesting from that point of view is an integration of shadow concerning the shadow and concerning darkness and maybe living with and perhaps romancing.
But there's, I think, also in terms of, in the literary sense, the greatest romantic story in the Muslim culture is, that would be the equivalent of Romeo and Juliet, is that of Majnun and Layli. And these names are both metaphorically. Layli, which is the woman, it means black.
Yes.
And Majnun, who is the lover, his real name was Qais, but he is called the insane one, the one who has gone out of his mind.
Yes.
And so I think we have a lot more in that context where the beauty is considered in the darkness, like in Persian and in Pashto poetry. The darker complexion is always referred to as the wheat colored complexion, which is admired. And you would say that in some cultures they would desire a lighter complexion. But when you go to the classical literature, it's the other way around. They would even call it namaki, for instance, which comes from the word salt. I don't know for whatever reason. But darker complexions are desired and admired. And so I think, anyways, I think I made the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaman. And I'm seeing that we're at 7 o'clock. So why don't I why don't we ask Dana if you want to wrap us up, and if Connie wants to have any last thoughts for us.
Right. Sure. Connie, is there something? I have a little bit of a closing ritual. And once again, I'm left with the whole notion that we come out of here with more questions and fewer answers, which is really the way that we want to have the Myth Salon and live our own lives. Down the path of inquiry and poetry rather than narrative. And, I am much more inclined to gravitate towards something that says, aha, I wonder what that is. My curiosity is piqued, and a little bit of lightness in the darkness works. But if you turn the light on in the darkness and you flood it, you can't see anything. You take all of the beauty out of what it has. So maybe you would give us some final words, Connie, and then I want to do my bell.
Well, I'll just pick up on what you just said. Shadow work is about lighting candles in the dark. Now, as I say the dark, I hesitate because of the linguistic limitations. But there's an image there of candles in the dark. It's a beautiful, it's a sacred image. And so I want to suggest that if you begin to do shadow work, if you begin to allow or even coax some of the material from your unconscious to pop out and then recede again, and then pop out the way that it does, and you begin to slowly make a conscious relationship with it, it really is like lighting candles in the dark. Mm-hmm. And you begin to see all new shapes and forms on the wall, and then eventually you get to know these parts of yourselves that have been so mysterious, and it's quite rewarding. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time with you.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you all very much. A beautiful couple hours. I do apologize to those who have said we should start and end on time. I was persuaded to start late, and I'm going to always yield to a government by committee, because it's just the nature of how I want to live my life. I can't control the interrelation, but I celebrate it. So we came from silence. Let's go back to it. Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. It's been a beautiful evening.
Yeah.
The recording tonight will be available on Mytho Sophia.
I'll type it in.
You'll type it in, and we'll get it to you. We'll clean it up a little bit, put a nice title on the front, and off we go.
Great.
Thank you all very
Thank
very
you, Dana,
much.
and Will, and thank you, Connie,
Thank you, Dennis.
and panelists, and all you participants.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.